Going to get started. The first thing I'm supposed to say is that we are audio-visually taping this event, and so and it will be for web broadcast
On Al Jazeera.
Yeah. Who knows? Could happen. So anybody who wishes to not be on the web broadcast should sit near the back of the room out of the view of the camera and speak softly. But if you are sitting in view and speaking, then you are consenting to appearing in the webcast. So I guess I should say also, please do turn off the ringers on your cell phone, although it's less critical in this intimate environment. Is it safe to assume that everybody here was at last night's event? Is that correct? Then I won't go into the depth of introduction that, at least not for REA, that I would otherwise. My role is simply to moderate, and the format for today is, as is our tradition, to have other experts in related fields comment on the speaker's presentation from last night, but also provide some other comments, if they choose, about their interests that might dovetail with what he spoke about that are relevant. And so what we do is we'll have the two commentators go first, and then we'll give REA a chance to respond or to elaborate further, however he chooses, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. We were supposed to have an additional commentator, Jim Breckenridge, from Stanford's Center for...
It doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, well, I do want to say, because we did go out of our way to recruit an excellent commentator from the Stanford Center for Interdisciplinary Policy Education and Research on Terrorism, CPIRT, and he works with Phil Zimbardo on all kinds of interesting work on terrorism and counterterrorism there, and has an excellent background in having worked for 25 years at the Veterans Administration, but then turning to more empirical work on terrorism. So hopefully we'll get him back one day to talk to us about these things. But we're lucky to have our own Rob McCoon pinch hitting for Jim Breckenridge, and Rob has some thoughts on the issue and is going to share them with us as well. And being a social psychologist is certainly qualified to comment on REA's work. Okay, so let me start by introducing in the opposite order in which they will appear, so that I will introduce the first speaker last. What I will do is start by saying that we are fortunate to, I think I'm going to ask the Dean to comment first, so I'll start by saying a little bit, I'll reintroduce REA to say that you saw him last night, so I won't say too much, but I will just reiterate that he is among, if not the leading world authority on human motivation, and is applying his expertise in that area to understanding terrorism broadly, and now we know specifically also suicidal terrorism. And that's a good thing for psychology, and it's a good thing for public policy, and it's a good thing for national security. Rob McCoon, as I mentioned, is also a social psychologist. He received his doctorate from Michigan State. I can't recall which year, but you probably don't want me to say. Then went to the RAND Corporation for 7 years and got some training as a policy researcher and analyst before coming here, and has been here for 13 years. Yeah. Okay, so Rob has very diverse interests, but maybe most prominent amongst them in terms of substantive area are drug policy, and he has published with Peter Reuter a very influential and intensive and expansive book, Drug War Heresies, that really is kind of an international perspective on drug policy. I think of primary relevance today is his general, well, you decide what's relevant today, but I think of primary relevance today is his general and very deep expertise on judgment and decision making, and maybe you'll comment on some, how that interacts with the judgments and decision making of suicidal terrorists. Michael Nucht, our dean, who I will ask to speak first, is our Aaron Wildavsky dean, so especially appropriate for him to be commentating.
Whoever's the dean is the Aaron Wildavsky.
Yeah, well, and you're the first Aaron Wildavsky dean. Although I guess
Before
Aaron Wildavsky was the first Aaron Wildavsky dean, but as these academic things go, Michael Knock is the first Aaron Wildavsky dean of public policy. Michael served on the faculty of the University of Maryland, which is where Aryeh hails from, so we have a nice connection there. Michael having been the dean of the School of Public Affairs at Maryland. But he's also done several stints in government, including serving in the Clinton administration on nuclear national security issues. I don't want to get this wrong, so I'm going to resort to my notes.
You can skip it.
No. Well, I think that the primary thing to comment on is this is Michael is moving on. He's questing further significance, and he's
Doesn't sound good.
no,
It's
I
on
don't
the
think he's
list.
at risk. I don't think
I have here a belt.
there's no risk involved here of Michael Knock becoming a suicidal terrorist, I don't believe. But he is moving on from the deanship after serving for 10 years extremely effectively as the dean of the school, a period of considerable expansion and all kinds of exciting developments, and we're sorry to see him go. I've known nobody but Michael Knock just because this is my 8th year here, and so I'm really experiencing all kinds of terror management, not knowing what to expect. Michael is, by training, his training is in engineering and political science, and he's written, for example, a book titled The Age of Vulnerability, Threats to the Nuclear Stalemate, published by Brookings, and several other books that nicely integrate foreign policy, national security, and public policy analytic approaches. It goes without saying that he's published extensively. Somebody in his esteemed position, of course. I noted in his bio that since in the period after September 11, he has chaired panels for the Defense Threat Reduction Advisory Committee on combating terrorists' use of weapons of mass destruction in the United States, so his expertise is very relevant. And he currently serves as a member of the Educators Advisory Committee of the Comptroller General of the United States, as a consultant for Sandia National Laboratories, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, and he's a member of the Senior Advisory Committee of Los Alamos National Laboratory. So he probably spends too much time near highly enriched uranium and sets off alarms at airports as he passes through. That's why we've got him over in the corner of the room. But in any event, so Michael hopefully will provide some sort of national security perspective on this issue. But he's also very steeped in issues of terrorism and is a widely sought after expert on issues of terrorism. And you see him on TV all the time when something pops up in the media. So we're lucky to have him commenting, and it just so happens that he is the dean of the school. We're lucky in that regard too. So I think I will turn it over to Michael and ask you to comment.
Thank you. As Jack has said, I will not be helpful in adding to the literature review in social psychology on suicide bombers or on other things of a social psychological nature. That's clear, and we've got great experts to do that. So I will instead focus some comments for about 10 or maybe no more than 15 minutes max in 3 areas. The first is on some questions about the Kruglanski diagnosis of the suicide bomber. They're really questions I just would like to hear him expound upon. I'd like to spend more of my few minutes discussing counterterrorism. What do you do about it? Let's say you've got the diagnosis right, or pretty right. What do you do? That's primarily the kind of work I do. I'm in the business of trying to help people do something about these things. And I have some remarks to make in that area. And then the third is a subset of the second, which we've actually began to discuss a little bit last night, which is the special issue of the weapon of mass destruction suicide terrorist. Is there any distinction between someone who's going to have a backpack with a small bit of a high, or not such a small bit of high explosives versus someone who's actually going to detonate a nuclear weapon in New York City? Or is it a continuum? Or so? And again, and there, of course, fortunately, we have no data, so it's conjectural. But conjecture from Arya, based on his knowledge, would be very valuable to all of us. So let me go back to the first, just on issues of diagnosis. If I had a suitcase right here, a briefcase, like the one that was placed near Hitler in '44, and it went off right in front of me, and I was killed, and maybe several of you were killed, but you survived, and now you're being interrogated by the authorities. Who was this guy? You know, based upon what I've read and what you said last night, I think you would say some combination of the following: that he's from a collectivist society, a society that values the collective much more than the individual, that he's had some sort of trauma in his life, maybe a parent was killed, or a sibling or a spouse in a very, awful way, that maybe he's attracted to some, what we might call extreme ideological set of ideas, that he may have grandiose plans about being remembered in history for this, killing one of the world's great social psychologists, which I would have failed, but I tried. Or undoing loss, maybe, in fact, I was about to be fired as dean and I didn't want people to know, so I blew myself up before. Undoing, or that would be preventing significant loss, I guess. And actually, that was one thing I did want to ask you about, to clarify a little bit on the distinction between undoing significant loss versus preventing significant loss. Or undoing loss, I guess the example of that would be I had already had some major stigma. I really had, a whole list of my medical records had been released, and I was quite even more disturbed than most of my colleagues think I am. And now to rectify that, I'm going to, create this, do this great act of heroism. So some combination. That's the mix, if I have it right. So some questions. First of all, is there any way to weight one versus the other? Sort of a classical question. I mean, if it turns out I don't check every one of these boxes, are there some you'd be looking for more than others? Or any way to differentiate among the factors? Of course, it's clear that there's a heterogeneity of possible motives for suicide missions, but how do you weight them in any way? Or is that just unknowable? On the collectivist society side, are there examples of collectivist societies that are more pacific? I mean, I don't know, are Polynesian islanders in the Western Pacific, do they have a view that's really about their collective much more than the individual, but all they want to do is, lie on the beach and eat coconuts? What is it about a collectivist society in particular that drives people to be amenable to suicide? I mean, and are there variations within? Now, this may be an area you haven't studied enough yet. I don't know, but I think I find the term collectivist society something that requires additional probing. I could be a Muslim, and a lot in the Quran does deal with kind of collectivist sort of perspectives on things, but yet there are hundreds of millions, 1 billion Muslims who would never even think of doing this. So what is it about the explicit features of a collective, of a person's view of their society that puts them in the ballgame here? Just to probe a little bit on that. I assume, of course, also there's a kind of classical statistical question here. You have a kind of type 1, type 2 error. You're going to, have false alarms. At times you're going to say, oh, he knocked, he fits everything, arrest that guy before he does it. Or you're going to say, gee, he looks like a pretty nice guy, and the next thing you know, I'm going to blow up the place. So both errors are going to happen. Where do you want to set the bar? Presumably you'd rather arrest me and be wrong than say he's a great guy and have the place blow up. So how does a government or the New York City Police Department or whoever set the bar in terms of these indicators and trying to minimize type 1 or type 2 error. On the issue of motivation and related to questions about becoming a great historical figure or having a trauma, just question of fact, I don't know. I had the impression from what I did read about Muhammad Atta from 9/11, he was a sort of what we'd call kind of a middle-class guy. He was getting a master's degree in urban planning at University of Hamburg. And maybe he had had some personal trauma in his family. I don't know. You probably do know about that. I don't. So I would just, as one very prominent example, after he led, operationally, he led the 9/11 attack. Does he fit? Where does he fit in this set of categories, and where does he not fit? Just as one. You did talk about the Ramzi Youssef, but I'd like to hear about Atta. Also, one of the questions last night, some additional probing on the people who basically are the orchestrators or motivators of the suicide bombers. How many of these characteristics do they have to have? Because as someone was pointing out, Ayam al-Zawahiri comes from a very distinguished family. He was himself trained as a cardiologist. He comes from sort of like the Pacific Heights of Cairo. His relatives who were judges, who were legal scholars, who are mullahs in the religious movements, none of whom became radicalized. And yet he was the one who was implicated in the Sadat assassination. He was the one who was screaming and yelling in the jail. He's the one who got radicalized and went to Afghanistan. He's the one who joined up with bin Laden. He's the one who was considered the great strategist of al-Qaeda today. So, what about his cousin? Why didn't his cousin, who might be, I don't know, might own a diamond shop in downtown Cairo and have all the same profile, why is he selling diamonds? And this guy is, So any clarification there would be helpful. So I'm just trying to probe a little bit more on the causality side. Any advice, guidance you can give the policy community about a bit more sharper on what to look for, and anything else you'd like to add on that. So those are just some very sort of almost trite observations about the causes. On counterterrorism, let me marry it to some broader issues of national security policy. The national security community constantly is revising and re-revising and re-revising its views on how we think about national security. At the moment, and of course this will change as soon as a new administration comes in next year, there are 4 Ds, starting with the letter D, that are kind of a canonical way that a lot of the people in the community are thinking about national security. Deterrence, dissuasion, defense, and defeat. Those are the 4 Ds. So let me just say a word about each. And the question is, which, if any, are applicable here and which are not? After the 9/11 attacks, no less a figure than Rumsfeld, who after all was Secretary of Defense and has quite a lot of credentials in this area, although since greatly damaged by the Iraq War, said deterrence is dead. Deterrence is dead. These guys are crazy. You may not like the term crazy. He'll use the term crazy. We can't deter them in any way. There's no set of incentives or disincentives that are going to prevent a guy like Atta from blowing himself up by smashing himself into a building at 550 miles an hour and killing 2,000 people. We have to do other things. We try to do a lot of things, but deterrence, forget about it. And then slowly but surely, the community, this amorphous group of people in and out of government who think about these things, have been pushing back. Say, well, not so fast, maybe not dead, maybe we have to revise it, maybe it's deterrence prime, we've got to shift it. So the way I think about deterrence is, it's a set of incentives and disincentives that are sufficiently persuasive. First of all, they have to be communicated. So the recipient of the primarily threats, but it could also be positive incentives. The communication of the threat is received by the intended recipient, and that person does essentially a cost-benefit analysis and says, you know what, the cost of going ahead now that I've received this threat outweigh the benefits. I'm not going to do something I was planning to do. And then he's been deterred. And there's a whole literature on this. So, is that still applicable to some of these individuals or groups, or does it largely have to be put aside for other reasons? Sort of So to sharpen the question a little bit is, what is the applicability of traditional concepts of deterrence when we're dealing with this kind of behavior? Dissuasion is something viewed a little differently. I was reading, for example, I was actually scanning the web about this. There was an article in the web that in 2004, after there had been a bunch of suicide bombings on buses in Israel, that I don't know if this was the Shin Bet or who it was, put pig fat on buses, and that was the headline of this URL. When it said Israelis put pig fat on buses, and it was under the suicide bombing. I said, so, and what it said was that for many, most, perhaps virtually all religious Muslims, touching or connecting with a pig precludes entry to heaven. So this was learned by the authorities in Israel. They put pig fat on a bus. I guess maybe they advertised it. Maybe they had on the side of the bus, this bus carries pig fat.
Good thing they had Russians to do it.
They had Russians, right? And so this to me is a form, it's sort of down the road to deterrence, but it's sort of a form of dissuasion. It's saying, here, Michael's ready to get on that bus and blow himself up, but I can't do that if I'm going to touch pig fat, and then I don't get to heaven, and the whole rationale is just blown up. So if it's not quite measures of deterrence, are there more subtle or forms of dissuasion that still, I'm ready to do it, I want to do it, I have the trauma, I want the fame, I come from the collectivist group, I'm checking all the boxes, but I say, pig fat, can't do it. Now defend, that's the example of that, of course, is the wall in Israel, right? You physically stop people from doing it. You can't change their mind, but you just make it hard. They just can't get in. Are there other examples of physical or even non-physical forms of defense against the suicide bombing that we need to think about? And then in the area of defeat, that's also quite interesting and controversial. A colleague of mine from many years ago, Steve David from Hopkins, do you know him at all? He hasn't written a lot on this, but he did study the targeted assassination policy of the Israeli government against Hamas leaders in particular, and then they also did kill a couple of Hezbollah leaders.
Recently, yeah.
Recently. I was actually in Israel up at the Lebanese border. It was crowded one day. I went up there and I was talking to some people who sort of claim they know what they're talking about. And this one person, it's very anecdotal, was saying that in fact he thought the targeting of, he says, I don't know anything about Hamas. I'm here in the north. I do Hezbollah. That's my, you got to specialize. All I can tell you is, he says, targeting Hezbollah leaders, no good. This guy's a hawk. He's got all kinds of military stuff on his head. I mean, this guy's not a, Berkeley latte sipping, lovely guy. He's a tough guy. So I said, I'm surprised you say that. I would think you would be very supportive of targeted assassinations of Hezbollah leaders. He says, no, because basically it motivates, it's something related to what you said, Leslie. It motivates them to sometimes retaliate in ways that they wouldn't have done if we hadn't, in a way, provoked them. It's like sticking a sleeping dog with a stick. He says, for example, he says, I can't tell you a lot about it, but there was the attack of the synagogue in Buenos Aires, and that this was a direct retaliation by Hezbollah to our Israeli killing of one of their leaders in Lebanon. And we have information that if we hadn't killed that guy, they wouldn't have blown up that synagogue. So now we're getting to the issues of defeat. We're really trying to destroy these people or destroy the facilities. There have been other Israeli tactics, you know much more about this than I do, such as destroying the homes of the relatives of the suicide bomber. So where do we have any sense at all when you really, in a way, use military or other kinds of physical violence to defeat the adversary? What's really effective and what isn't? Let's put aside all prejudices and, what does the data tell us? Because in one form or other, deter, dissuade, defend, and defeat, will be massaged and remassaged, repackaged, renamed, and it'll come out in March of '09 as the new U.S. national security strategy. And it's really just minor variations of these. So it would be nice to know, on the particular issue of suicide bombing, whether, is there payoff in certain areas rather than other areas. Because to the extent that you discussed counterterrorism last night, you talked about more not trying to provoke, not trying to exacerbate grievances. It's a much more, carrot incentive side than a stick disincentive side. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. And finally, on issues of weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear, well, of course, essentially since 9/11, really mostly since 9/11, although there was some of this going on before, it is claimed that the single greatest threat to U.S. national security is a suicide bomber detonating a nuclear weapon in New York or Washington. It's very explicit. It's that. That's it. That has replaced 3,000 Soviet reentry vehicles coming in here in 30 minutes. Because the suffering of such a catastrophic, such a cataclysmic catastrophe would have, indeterminate negative consequences for American society. Of course, obviously for the people killed, if it was in Washington, for the entire governmental apparatus and our leadership, the world economy. I mean, the stock markets would, collapse all over the world, I think, instantaneously, or they go down. I mean, maybe Gino would know better, but 80%.
I hold wheat.
He'd have to sell his wheat one little piece at a time. So this is claimed to be, among all the priorities, the top priority. So there is discussion in lots of places about, okay, would these guys do it? How would they do it? Who would they send? What form would the weapon take? I mean, there's been enormous amount of work on this, none of which I'll comment on in detail, but I can just tell you it's going on. Well, just recently we had a discussion. We honored Tom Schelling here, Nobel laureate, wonderful man we've all known for many decades. So this was raised in one of the discussions in this Schelling Symposium just a couple of weeks ago. And Schelling, was a very creative guy, out-of-the-box thinker and all that. And his view was when the Muhammad Attas of the nuclear suicide mission in New York are sitting around getting strapped on or whatever, that he thought, of course it's Schelling conjecture, but Schelling conjecture is worth listening to, that, and Rob was there, so maybe he'll correct me if I don't have it right. He thought that they'd say, well, my family might be disgraced, that the personal calculations of the suicide bomber might lead them to pause. No matter what their leaders had told them and their supervisors and their guys who said, everything's great, the 72 ladies are lined up, everything's ready to roll here. My own view is a rather different view, but of course it's also not based on data. My own view is I am uninformed about whether the person who's getting ready for the job would do it, although I personally have high confidence they would do it once they get the right person. I think for these reasons, they'll get a person who checks the Kruglanski boxes. That person is ready to roll. The question that I have is, would the leadership authorize it? And here, my view, which gets perhaps outside the realm of social psychology, but let me just say very quickly, and this will be my final comment. To me, Al-Qaeda in particular, is a movement. And movements think about a lot of things, but more than anything, they think about sustaining and enlarging the movement. The movement itself becomes the goal. And therefore, recruitment is recruitment and retention, something I've had to deal with in 10 years, is an essential, it's a high among the highest priorities, right? If recruitment is down and retention's down, your movement is, they're going to go to somebody else. That's why, maybe with the Iranian thing, maybe the Iranians have a better idea, even though it's Shia, not Sunni. Okay, so the question I think bin Laden and Zawahiri has is, if we actually have our friend here who's ready to go to New York City and blow himself up with a nuclear weapon and kill 4 million Americans instantaneously, and with blast radiation, heat effects, electromagnetic pulse, and all the other things that go on in a nuclear weapon, something I know something about, you might have 7 or 8 million deaths. 7 or 8 million deaths within the space of a few weeks. Well, that, of course, dwarfs any number of any set of fatalities we've ever had. All the fatalities the U.S. has had in its 225-year history times a gigantic amount. I mean, we had, how many people were killed? There were 600,000 people killed in the Civil War, which is by far the largest set of fatalities of any war. Well, this is 6 million people. It's 10 times the amount. And the likelihood of cancer rate and recurrence of cancer in the New York metropolitan area will be 20 times the normal rate. That's what it is in Hiroshima. I went to Hiroshima to talk to people there. So I don't know if they go over the whole list, but clearly Zawahiri and bin Laden would say, okay, so for us the question is, this would be a spectacular that would dwarf 9/11. Got it. But I think their operational question is, how does this affect recruitment and retention? And there, I think the jury's out. Because, of course, there may be people, I don't know, in Damascus who'd celebrate. But isn't it possible that many people, Muslims all over the world, would be abhorred by this? And say, this is beyond the pale? Again, it's a question. But I think because of the magnitude of the fatalities that we're talking about with the use of a weapon of mass destruction as opposed to a suicide bomber with a backpack, I'm just wondering whether the calculus of the suicide bomber might change as a result of just dealing with WMD. So, end of comments. Just a bunch of questions. You know, academia is progress through questions.
So if that isn't a sufficient list of questions for you to keep in your head, we're going to now have Rob's points to that as well. So keep taking notes.
Forward to Rob's.
On the basis of Michael's comments, if we want to take a break for anyone to go get their car, collect their family, and head to Oklahoma. Okay, I first of all, I'm greatly honored to be able to comment on your work. Been reading your work for years, and I have just about zero authority to do so here because I'm not an expert in terrorism, but I've touched on some similar issues in various ways. And one of the things I was thinking about last night was I was just remembering when I first came to RAND, I had a security clearance at RAND mostly so I could be a peer reviewer for some projects, and so sometimes I would be over where where Brian Jenkins' office was, where as far as I know, the first major terrorism project at RAND was. And the RAND terrorism database was a rubber-banded stack of index cards on Brian's desk. And I mean, one of the things I was struck by is just how much more sophisticated the whole enterprise has gotten. I mean, that's the good news. Of course, the bad news is the reason it's gotten so much more sophisticated is, first of all, we have a much bigger database to draw on. And the problem has just become much more serious. So, so I want to approach this from several different angles. One is just to mention that how I saw this sort of paralleling as an inferential problem, a topic I've been involved in involving the military. While I was at RAND, I worked on the gays in the military issue, and a big part of the gays in the military debate involved the question of unit cohesion and what makes a group work together, and is that important? If so, why is it important, and how does it work? And I've remained part of that debate. Most recently, article in Armed Forces Society, which was my critique of the Army War College study of cohesion among U.S. forces in Iraq. And the authors of the Army War College study went into print with this study back when we were still in the mission accomplished phase. And if you read their article now, you have to wince because they talk about why were we so supreme in our victory, and so in a way, attacking their study is like shooting fish in a barrel. But there is an inferential problem, which is in real-world conflict situations, trying to reconstruct why something goes well or something goes badly on the basis of very limited cues. And part of what the Army War College researchers were trying to do was just piece together. They can't do an experiment. The real-world variables are all confounded, and it's just a tremendous inferential problem. And I think that's very much what we're facing here. We have a lot of confounded variables. We have sparse data. We have error-filled data. There are probably biases in the data, and we don't even know the direction of the biases. So it's a real challenge. And one of the things I want to say is how delighted I am that someone who's such a distinguished academic, experimental psychologist would put aside the neat, tidy world of where you can really have control over variables and plunge into an important problem like this. I feel that far too few psychologists have been willing to get their hands dirty by dealing with real-world problems, and it's partly because they want the rigor, and you just can't be rigorous with a problem like that. So, I want to take up the question of how to approach this question theoretically, and how you and your group are approaching it theoretically. And one of the suggestions you made last night, I mean, you very effectively put up a huge list of different explanations, and then you asked, what doesn't predict terrorism? And then you offered us an integrative concept. And it's hard to be against an integrative concept. I mean, who could be against integrative thinking?
But you'll try.
But I'm about to. And here's what I worried, and there's some irony because it's you that I'm saying this to, but here's what I worry is that an integrative construct could lead to premature cognitive closure. That we don't know enough about this topic, and you have come up with an integrative construct that is so effective at integrating the different perspectives that it assimilates. It made me think of, I'm the only one in the room I know who has ever watched Star Trek, but it made me think of the Borg who assimilate all. And I wanted to suggest that two other ways that the problem could be approached, and I don't know that they're better, but they're different ways. And one is actually to be atheoretical. And this is what's in the forecasting, in many different forecasting literatures. There are some forecasters who explicitly endorse an atheoretical approach. It's sort of a brute force approach. And we have computer algorithms that will test every possible interaction among variables and so on. And this approach has been used to try to predict dangerousness, for example, in the criminal justice system and in the mental health system for many years. So one approach is purely this brute force sort of statistical approach. I think even in the best of circumstances, there are lots of problems with the brute force approach. There's a risk of capitalization on chance associations and so on. But I think you're dealing with such sparse data that the brute force approach we probably need theory. I think the atheoretical approach can't work when you have so few cases because you just don't have enough data to really run these iterative statistical algorithms. Now another approach, so you can be atheoretical or you can have a theory, but a third possibility is to explicitly decide to have multiple theories. And I'm thinking of the biologist Platt's classic paper in Science in the 1960s on what he calls strong inference, and Platt's idea that science progresses fastest when researchers are testing not a single theory to confirm or refute it, but testing competing theories. And I wonder if it might be helpful in this case to set up almost some straw man kind of theories that are maybe seem implausibly extreme, but are distinct theories, and sift the data with respect to these different theories. And I just wonder whether that might bring into focus more issues, because my concern is the possibility that the search for significance could work as a construct much like Irving Janis's construct of groupthink. And groupthink is a powerful concept because when a group does something bad, you can always find groupthink. And so it's a very alluring concept. The problem is when groups do things well, nobody looks to see if there was groupthink there as well. And I saw this quote in the New York Times the other day that economists have predicted 20 of the last 8 recessions, and this is the danger. I mean, this is the danger. You can have a theory that working backwards from a known terrorist incident will explain that incident, but there are lots of people out there who would fulfill your recipe quite well. Interestingly, though, Janis, although I have some concerns about his theory construction, Janis's advice about what to do about groupthink, I think, is enormously helpful. He had very specific pieces of advice, and one of them was the idea of devil's advocates, having devil's advocates, and which I think is really the idea of having multiple theories on the table. And this,
I'm not sure that devil's advocate is a good theory. No, I'm just kidding.
Get you behind me. Now, while I was at Rand, this was not classified. I can talk about this, right? Yeah. One of the projects I was asked to be a reviewer on, Paul Davis and his colleagues were back in the late 1980s trying to model Saddam Hussein. Trying to be able to predict Saddam Hussein's behavior, and trying to come up with a really sort of credible. Now, this wasn't like a computer model or something, but just sort of a set of principles that would allow you to predict what Saddam Hussein would do. And they asked me, because I'm a psychologist, to comment on this. And I said, first thing I said is, boy, this is one thing we really do not do well in psychology. We do better with sort of aggregate statistical averages.
But you do know about Bob Abelson's attempt to model Barry Goldwater.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there's
been tried.
There's been, and they're good, and they're really good reasons to want to do it. So the fact that it's hard to do doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Of course they should do it. But I sent them all these papers in the psychology literature on what are called debiasing strategies, and one of them is called Consider the Opposite strategy, in which people get locked into one mindset, and sometimes considering the opposite can be useful. And basically what I suggested was build multiple models of Saddam Hussein, and because we have no idea which is the good model, look for policy responses that are robust across models. And that's what I would think we might want to do with terrorism, since we really don't know what causes terrorism. Keep on the table multiple theories of terrorism, and not rule out any prematurely, and then try to find policies that would work under any of the theories. If a policy only works under one of the theories, it's not a very robust strategy, and unless we really know that theory is the right theory, it may not be worth doing. So now this is easier said than done, and I'm not even sure what form these multiple theories would take. But so one of the things I would hope is that we don't find the right theory too quickly before we know everything we should know. Now, another set of comments I have just briefly on the issue of deterrence is that, there, in some ways it's just going to echo what Michael said, but I think, one approach, of course, is to try to identify someone's motives and use that diagnostically to predict who's going to be a terrorist and find them. And this is the approach that's used in criminal justice profiling. It's a very difficult approach when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of potential terrorists meeting a profile. And another approach is, and so that's more of an ex-ante approach, sort of before the event occurs. Another approach, and this is maybe not for the politically squeamish, but is ex post, finding ways to undermine the significance of the act when it occurs. And I think, frankly, one way of doing this is to personalize the victims. I think we all, in terrorist acts, we depersonalize the victims, and as Stalin said, one dead Russian soldier is a tragedy and 1 million dead Russian soldiers is a statistic. And one of the things that happens in a big terrorist incident is we sort of depersonalize it, and then we lose sight of the fact that these were, you didn't kill some idea, you killed some kid, or you killed some mother or father, and maybe there could be more we could do in that respect. In terms of game theory of deterrence, usually you try to figure out what's costly to the other side and make it costly for them. And this is a little tricky when someone's willing to kill themselves, because usually that's like the biggest stick we have, is to threaten them with death. I was wondering, I don't know for a fact, but perhaps something that's, for someone who's not afraid to die, something that would be a pretty worst case scenario for them would be to have the mission get botched. Because if the mission is botched, you don't get to go to paradise, and you're now going to sit and rot in a cell. And, of course, so the glib thing to say is, let's make sure we botch all their missions. But another thing is to make sure that we publicize those missions that do get botched, and really just keep publicizing to sort of increase the prospect of failure, and make someone who's contemplating this realize just how easy it is to have it go badly and end up spending the rest of your life in a prison cell. Of course, the danger is that you simply motivate them to get better at it, and so this is complicated. Finally, you can provide alternative routes to significance, and here I was struck by work that I've done in the courts on what's called procedural justice. And in the 1980s, Alan Lynn and Tom Tyler and I did some surveys of tort litigants and criminal justice defendants, and we found that people in the courts they had this overpowering motive to tell their side of the story, to have voice. When we measured all the different attributes of a trial and asked both plaintiffs and defendants to rate what they liked about a trial, they didn't care about delay in the court. They didn't care about the size of the award, surprisingly, nearly as much as they cared about two factors that we just kind of tossed in that turned out to be hugely important. An item saying I was treated with dignity, and an item saying I was treated with respect. And you mentioned this idea of dignity and respect last night, and I was just, I don't have solutions, but finding opportunities to enhance a sense of dignity and respect in populations that don't feel that they have dignity and respect seems like an important part of diffusing this. So thanks.
And now I'm going to exercise, thank you, Rob and Dean. I'm going to exercise my prerogative to just jump in and make a few comments of my own, because I have a little bit of relevant expertise as well.
Sorry.
One thing is I'm just going to maybe rephrase some concepts that Rob brought up in a slightly different way, which is to invoke my favorite logical fallacy, affirming the consequent, which is an area that a consideration we have to make when trying to predict who's going to commit some kind of act, and in this case an act of suicidal terror. That known suicidal terrorists have been seeking significance, or have had conditions that would lead one to seek significance, does not necessitate that people who seek significance will become suicidal terrorists. And the denominator there is so huge. Most of the world is seeking significance. And as you say, what doesn't motivate it and who's not seeking significance. So that's just something to bear in mind. But I think it also comes around to the other issue, which I think you are sensitive to, which is that this is really not so much about predicting who's going to commit an act of suicidal terror. There are too many thousands of people who we would have to, that the haystack is too large to try to go about it that way. It's really more about getting at these root causes, providing situations for dignity and respect that would undermine the more general motivating factors. So that's just another way of saying what I think everybody's kind of been saying already. The research that I've done that I think is relevant is on hate crime. And and it's important to distinguish between hate crime and terrorism, although they bear some similarities. But I think the primary distinction between hate or bias crime and terrorism is that a hate crime need only be motivated by hate toward the group to which the victim belongs. It doesn't have to be motivated by a desire to terrorize that group. You might be trying to terrorize the individual victim, but by strict definition, it was really only primarily motivated by hate or bias toward that group, not a desire to achieve some kind of political end. Terrorism is probably motivated by a hate of the group to which the victims belong, but is a more strategic, typically sort of thing with a desire to achieve some kind of political end or change the status quo in some way. So they're different in that respect, but they're similar in terms of how we need to try to study them, because it's also difficult to find hate crime perpetrators and learn about them, because for one thing, most of them don't ever get caught. Among those who do get caught, they're different from the ones who don't get caught. And so interviewing incarcerated hate crime perpetrators leads to all kinds of potential bias, because they may be more egregious than others, they may be more stupid than others. Whatever it is that got them caught differentiates them from the other 99% who are at large. So we've gone about some interesting ways to try to understand what motivates hate crime. One was this is work I did with Don Green at Yale and others. One was a very econometric analysis to just look at economic factors that had been presumed to be causes of hate crime and have been presumed by others to be causes of terrorism. And in both cases, it looks like economic factors are probably at least not very proximal causes of hate crime or terrorism. So that's one approach. Another approach we took was to actually try to find, and I think this is maybe something that could be fruitful for studying terrorists, to find a group of people who are maybe at a higher likelihood of being of perpetrating a hate crime, and try to find out something about them and what motivates them. And one approach that we took my colleagues and I took, was to identify white racist websites and chat rooms on the internet, and to sort of infiltrate them in a way that was much safer than actually physically infiltrating white racist groups physically. And to pose various scenarios to the people who were there under the guise of being just another visitor to these chat rooms, and find out conduct an experimental analysis to find out what things motivated them the most. In this case, anti-black hate crimes seem to be motivated the most by threats to what we call genetic integrity, but they were basically threats of black men marrying white women or dating white women. That was very clearly what evoked the strongest tendency to respond. And the relevance here, potentially methodologically, was that we found a group that maybe wasn't likely, more likely than not to commit hate crimes, but more likely than the general public to commit at least anti-black hate crimes, and to ask them what they would do under these various circumstances. So what would you do if, we said, my sister is thinking of getting married to this black guy, what should I do? And then code their response. By the way, to that scenario, more than half of the respondents advocated some kind of violence, and then you can code their response. And doing it on the web is very convenient, because you get a nice text that you can code.
It was later discovered that every person in that chat room was an assistant professor of psychology.
Well, there is a kernel of truth. We did encounter at least one other person who was also observing. It's entirely possible. So whatever it was, they had the same theory that we did, because they confirmed it. So that's another way. And then there was another study that I was more marginally involved in, where we used media reports of hate crimes, and we tracked down the perpetrators who had not been caught but were identified in some way, and we included them in a general survey that a professional company was conducting. And so they were asked questions, and there we were able to ask them in the same time period how they reacted to certain things, and compare them to a non-hate crime perpetrator sample. And it turned out that they were more concerned about things like laws banning the burning of the Confederate flag and interracial marriage than they were concerned about economic threats and the like. So there are ways to study it's these similar kinds of populations who are somewhat elusive, very extreme in their ideology, but more similar to the general public in many traits than people assume. So that's just a sort of a methodological suggestion. And then I think just very quickly I wanted to elaborate a little bit on something that Michael was saying with regard to all the 4 Ds, and add a 5th D, which is deference. And I think it's a lot like dissuasion, but the idea being that in counterterrorism, especially with suicidal terrorists who don't mind dying for the cause, you can't threaten them with much punishment. Although I agree that putting them in a cell in Guantanamo is probably not what they aspire to, but the idea, the primary quasi-deterrent approach is to try to defer them to lower value targets, so that at least if they do succeed, they'll have less of an impact, and that will also be something of a deterrent ultimately, because they want to be successful in a big way to have that kind of significance. And I don't know if there's any dose-response relationship in their minds with regard to how many virgins they're going to get depending on how many people they kill. I haven't gotten any sense that there is, but maybe at least implicitly.
It's
yeah.
an all or nothing. You
It's
either
all or
get
nothing.
all 72 or
or
not.
I can't
How about the
understand.
Viagra supply?
You get your own 72, or do they all share the 72?
Well, they
That's
wouldn't-
unclear, but they're all extremely beautiful, and the number is 72. Do they all
Well,
get the
they're
same?
virgins, you can't start-
Yeah,
Probably
they
not.
can't.
Probably that would not be very useful if they all got the same 72.
Actually, on this point, is the contract there that that the act has to be successful? Let's say they do botch the act. They do exactly what they're supposed to do, but somehow they get thwarted. I mean, are they being rewarded for intent or for the outcome? I mean, do they get a paradise promised to them?
If they die,
If
if
so
they
they
die,
have
if they're caught and put in jail,
Okay.
then
Okay, so that's important.
Not
No
even
deal.
when they die later,
Deals
they
of-
don't just
I don't
try
think
and-
so, no.
So it's really
yeah,
okay. That's
they have to at least explode themselves.
okay.
Well, I'll leave it at that,
Okay.
and we'll give Ari a chance to
Well,
respond to these many.
you've made so many extremely interesting comments. I've been making copious notes, and I have about 17 pages of notes, and there's no way in which I can respond in any organized manner to the interesting things that you've been bringing up. So let me try page by page to see what I can say in response. First of all, the issue of collectivist society. Collectivist society can subscribe to a variety of different ideologies. Not all collectivist societies require a violent response. Many collectivist societies are peaceful, communal, all kinds of movements that are distinctly anti-violence. What collectivist societies require is the sacrifice of individual interest in the interest of the group. That's one aspect that collectivism requires, but it does not need to be violent at all. So it's a specific type, specific content of collectivist ideology that in this particular case that we are concerned with is the rise of fundamentalist Islam that led to the danger that we are facing today. Ethno-nationalist ideologies that require similar sacrifices, such as the ideology of the Tamil Tigers of Elam in Sri Lanka, is of a similar kind. But collectivism does not need to be invoked in the context of intergroup conflict. If it is invoked in the context of intergroup conflict, and if it requires a violent response, then it can provide the warrants for terrorism. You asked, Michael, whether there's any way to weight these different factors, the ideology, the personality, and I think there is. To the extent that the ideology is strong, to the extent that the ideology rests on a shared reality that's widely accepted in the group, personality plays a smaller role. So, for example, if you look at a small group of urban terrorists, the Bader-Meinhof, the ETA, the Brigate Rosse, to join that kind of group, you have to have a certain type of personality to a much greater extent than if you're a member of the Palestinian community that supports the national Palestinian struggle pervasively and ubiquitously. You don't have to have any particular personality. Not only that, the more conformist, the more attuned you are to the collectivist ideology, the more likely you're going to try to defend the group by subscribing to the dictates of the ideology. So quite to the contrary, you don't have to be deviant from society in order to do it. So the weighting depends on the degree of support. We have in terrorism research a model of pyramid, that a pyramid rests on a broad community support that is necessary for the apex to actually carry out the terrorist acts. And to the extent that the broad base of support crumbles, very often the terrorist movements crumble as well. The Weathermen underground here in this country crumbled once the New Left withdrew its support from the movement. The Front de Libération de Québec also crumbled and disappeared once the Parti Québécois withdrew its support. So the strength of the ideology rests on the degree to which the ideology is shared in the community at large. If it is shared, it's easier to recruit people to the cause, and if not, then much greater effort is required to isolate the group, and the composition of the group requires and rests more on personalities that are prone to extreme ideation, extreme commitment, and so forth. People like Muhammad Atta, people like Osama bin Laden, I think we talked about it yesterday, that the opportunity for them to become extremely significant figures is not something that they could attain by being a successful professional, a doctor, a merchant, a businessman. It's a unique opportunity that's provided by the ideology, and of course you have to have a certain personality, and that's the predisposing factor to embrace that opportunity, and you have to have a certain type of megalomania or quest for significance that is unusual. And Zawahiri would be a person of that kind, that he sees that opportunity, identifies with the cause, and sees the way to his significance by becoming a leader. A comment has been made about the fact that in many cases the leaders like Osama bin Laden or Zawahiri do not themselves become suicide bombers. They can attain a much greater significance if they lead the movement, if they inspire the movement, if they deal with the contingencies and the chess game that is being carried out, than if they themselves died in the act of terrorism. So it's very consistent with the idea of significance quest, that they choose the best vehicle for them to become significant. A lot has been said about counterterrorism. Michael, you talked about counterterrorism, and we recently wrote a very extensive monograph with Martha Crenshaw at Stanford, Jerry Post, who had been involved in terrorism studies, and Jeff Victorov on metaphors of counterterrorism. Relates to this idea of different theories. There have been several approaches, several metaphors of counterterrorism. The most widely known is counterterrorism is the war metaphor. And that's been embraced by the Bush administration in the wake of 9/11. The war metaphor, as with any metaphor, has some advantages and many disadvantages. The advantages are that it mobilizes the society to an extreme effort. The disadvantages are that such extreme effort cannot be sustained for very long. It causes a drain on the society's resources, both human resources, economic resources, resources of all possible kinds. Emotional resources. The war metaphor draws on historical analogies that may or may not be appropriate. as with any metaphor, it's an oversimplification. And as with any closure, the risk is of it being an inappropriate closure. The war metaphor expects a quick victory, expects some kind of yielding and a clear-cut overcoming of the enemy. It expects that the effort would not last too long, and it's not clear. And of course, it ignores the other side's motivation, the other side's ideology. It assumes that the military force alone would provide the solution, that the enemy can be destroyed. And we've seen time and time again that when it comes to insurgency, when it comes to ideologically motivated struggle, the military response is very often ineffectual. Israel has been finding that in its struggle against the Palestinians. We have been finding it for a long while in our struggle in Iraq. The Soviets have found it in their struggle in Afghanistan, the French in Indochina. So insurgency, especially ideologically motivated insurgency, can overcome military power, however grand. And many of today's nations reflect a kind of terrorist struggle. Ethno-nationalism brought Algeria into being, Kenya into being, Israel into being. So when the ideology is very strong, military prowess alone doesn't seem to be effectual. Another metaphor that is often juxtaposed to the war metaphor is the law enforcement metaphor, treating terrorism as a crime. The advantage of that metaphor is that it's more surgical, it's more directed at the actual perpetrators as opposed to a nation, which is the case with war. And that, of course, has the advantage of reducing the possibility of collateral damage, of enraging whole masses of people, of labeling and categorization and stereotyping. So these are the advantages of a law enforcement metaphor. However, even with law enforcement, sophisticated forensic notions and theories of criminology suggest that even crime has to be fought through attainment of community support. So the criminals are between the government and the community. To the extent that the criminals are supported by the community, it's very difficult to defeat them. So it's important for the police to be sensitive to the community needs and within that context to pursue the criminals. It's much more so the case in the case of terrorism, because whereas crime is motivated by the profit motive in most cases, and only tangentially and in a perfunctory manner improvement the lot of the community, terrorism avowedly and distinctly is concerned with the interest of the community, to the extent that it represents the ideology shared in the community at large. It's very difficult to enlist the community's support in fighting the terrorists. And so the law enforcement metaphor is ignoring the ideological and community-based nature of the struggle. Another metaphor that's much broader is the epidemiological metaphor that distinguishes between the virus that carries the pathogen, that carries the ideology, in this case, it could be a virulent Islamist jihadist ideology, the conduit through internet, through mosques, through madrasas, and so forth, the susceptible population, and this already suggests a much more varied approach to terrorism, that you have to understand where it is being carried out, how to combat it, how to use the internet, how to identify those madrasas that are radicalizing and distinguish them from those who are not, how to immunize the population against this virulent attack. It's a much broader, much more social science-oriented kind of approach. And finally, there is an approach of prejudice reduction, which particularly emphasizes the idea of intergroup relations and intergroup tensions and ways of reducing those. So there is a whole lot of theories of what counterterrorism should consist of. Let me talk a bit about the issue of deterrence. I know that Tom Schelling, as a Cold War theorist, seems to believe, the last I talked to him, he was, by the way, on the panel with me, on the panel at the National Academies of Science for the study of counterterrorism. The idea of deterrence is to identify vulnerabilities of the other side and threaten those vulnerabilities. And to the extent that those vulnerabilities are typically defined in concrete terms, it seems that people who are ready to risk all, to sacrifice their lives, have no vulnerabilities because they're already putting everything on the line. But a broader conception of deterrence suggests that people do things for a reason, and they sacrifice their life for a reason. And therefore, it's in principle possible to persuade them, and this is where deterrence shades into dissuasion, that what they are doing, not the kind of dissuasion connected to the pig fat on buses, but intellectual dissuasion by credible authorities, that what they are doing, far from attaining the goal of significance, far from attaining the goal of martyrdom and heroism, is actually sinful from the standpoint of the ideology that they believe in. And to the extent that such effort is effectual, then they can be deterred. They can be deterred in the sense, broad sense of deterrence, of persuading them that should they engage in what they are planning to carry out, this would be detrimental to their goals. Their goals of significance, of martyrdom, would be sacrificed. It's a very, at the end of the day, at bottom, it's a very same motivational concept of deterrence, only the goals are different. The goals are not concrete. That said, those other types of deterrence are also applicable, particularly to the kind of organizations that have vulnerable, exposed territories, such as Hezbollah or Hamas, less so to diffuse organizations like Al-Qaeda, even less so to millenarian cults that really do not care about material, strategic, logistical kind of assets.
Do you want to give your voice a rest? And
Well, I still have, I think, a couple of points. Yeah, with respect to Tom Schelling's idea, I recently talked with Boaz Ganor about the fact of whether the sowing of doubt in the mind of the operative could not work. And psychologically, I think there are reasons to believe that it might. A person about to commit a terrorist operation, a suicide operation, is still a person, and it's not simple to sacrifice one's own life. It runs counter to the basic biological need of survival. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that at that moment, a concept can be accessible that what they're doing is wrong, that could introduce a hesitancy from the purely psychological perspective and deter them. This is, of course, not based on any empirical data, but from the psychological perspective, it's a difficult decision to make, and you have to be absolutely sure, to the extent that there is a shred of doubt, it might introduce a hesitancy. And there were cases of cold feet in the case of Palestinian terrorism. Right. There were cases in which the remote launcher had to detonate the explosive belts on their own because the terrorist was hesitant. The issue of weapons of mass destruction, a great deal of concern, a great deal of work. What kind of groups are likely to do it? The issue of motivation versus ability. Again, groups that care about world opinion in some sense, the world audience is important, are less likely to do it. Groups that do not want to take this one extra step that is going to be criticized broadly are less likely to do it. Again, the millenarian, culty type of groups, the mystical groups that see the end of the world, the destruction of the world system, the Armageddon, are more likely to do it. Ironically, the groups that are of this kind, the cultish groups, the groups that are led by extreme, crazy-like leaders, are less likely to have the capability. Al-Qaeda has flirted and tested a variety of chemical and biological agents over time. Osama bin Laden is known to have stated that it's a religious duty to try to do it. So they conceivably have the capability, the organizational, the financial capability to do it. On the other hand, they are not as irrational as they might seem. They have a particular interest in mind. I think they were unpleasantly surprised by the degree of vehemence in reaction to the 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. So I think that they would be more calculating than more extreme cultish groups. At the same time, the experts on WMD, as you well know, agree that there is at least a minimal possibility of this happening, and the time isn't working in our favor. Materials, scientific sophistication, availability becomes greater as time goes by, and the possibility cannot be excluded. So there is a great concern about that, and a lot of work is attempting to find what might be the indicators in the rhetoric of the leaders and in their circumstances. Having multiple theories is good. I think that any theory should probably try to develop their own theory and let others develop alternative theories. The kind of theory I've been propounding rests on a number of prior theories. There was a theory of psychopathology, that terrorists are psychopathological, and we have to identify them. Even Ariel Merari, an expert on suicidal terrorism, as late as 1990s, thought that suicidal terrorism are people who are motivated to die. So it's an individual level factor. He changed his mind and he now sees it as an organizational level factor. But that was one theory. Another theory was that there are situational factors, poverty, political oppression, and I do believe that these are contributing factors, that people who have otherwise hopeless prospects are more likely to buy into an ideology that allows them to realize the hopes for significance. So there were several theories that were proposed, and it's good to keep on thinking, because as you said, the data are sparse. The data are very sparse. We have in our START Center, we have about 80,000 cases. That doesn't sound like a sparse data base, but these are event data. So we have 80,000 terrorist events identified by the group, by the casualty caused, by the location, by the affiliation who claim responsibility. These data can answer some questions. They cannot answer all the questions. They cannot answer many questions. So sometimes we have to rely on interviews, however imperfect, and we have to exercise a great deal of common sense in addition to the data. There is a clamor for data on the part of many people, and one colleague of mine would like to collect brainwave data of incarcerated terrorists. And brainwave data are data, but the likelihood of them revealing something extremely significant, or their policy implications, how do you change people's brainwave data, are questionable. So, we've got to rely on whatever data we have, but at the same time think very hard and try to make sense of these events and devise policies in response. I better stop. My voice is giving out.
Well, thank you for those comments, and your voice is not off the hook yet, because we're going to take questions from the audience, and hopefully you'll be able to respond. So, who would like to take a shot? Rick?
Yeah, I guess I want to contradict the theory of significance quest.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good place to start.
It seems to me that the collective
You're not trying to be significant yourself, though. are you?
probably am, but the description of a collectivist society as one of sacrificing self-interest for the benefit of the group helps to explain to me why a mother would send her child out there. The child is obviously not looking for significance. The mother part of it could be that she's looking for significance from her neighbors, but it seems to me to be much more likely that it's out of devotion to the group, and that the concept of quest for significance is sort of a Western bias then. It's not a collectivist kind of thing to do, to seek significance for yourself.
That's a good point.
So are you saying, in fact, maybe we all carry within ourselves conflicting objectives. Could they both be alive? I mean, I want to become famous and I want to become known for killing the evil Americans, but on the other hand, I don't want to be out front and.
But if you're really into the collectivist mode, you supposedly have dismissed your own importance.
So,
A strategy, by the way, then would be to bomb the areas with DVD players with DVDs of good Western stuff, because essentially the Western type is not likely to sacrifice himself for the benefit of a group, unless, of course, in wartime it happens to be his own buddies or something of the kind.
Yeah. As a psychologist, I believe that individual actions are motivated by individual motives. These motives can be couched in individualistic interest terms, money, fame, and so forth, or they can be couched in collectivistic terms. And I think the mother who sacrificed the child, or even the child who is willing to be sacrificed, is individually motivated. The content of those motivations can be collectivistic, but a person who does something so that the group survives, that the group flourish, is still doing it, acting as an individual. The actions are individually based. So I believe that you're quite right, that it's for the sake of the group, but on part of the individual, this is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do means being a good person, being a good member of the group, being a good member of the collective. So at the end of the day, it is the individual who adheres to a given ideology for the sake of personal significance. It's like, the issue of altruism versus egoism. Is the altruist individually motivated? They are individually motivated, but this doesn't mean that they're not altruists. They're, the content of their motivation is different. The person who is willing to help others is still doing it for his or her own individual significance. That's what they believe is the right thing to do. So it's different from a person who does things out of greed. But in both cases, there is an individual motivation involved, because the actions are, the acting unit is the individual after all.
But that's almost by definition, that is, the individual has to make a decision to do
Absolutely.
something.
And I think that suggests that what is in the mind of the individual, every individual action is motivated. And so the question is, what is the nature of the motivation? And the motivation can be individually based, improvement of one's own material lot, or it can be contribution to the group. But the unit of the motivated unit, the action unit, is still the individual.
Yeah, I just don't see where that's because they're seeking significance, unless we've overstated the nature of a collectivist society. That is, that they're not really as different as we're thinking, and if that's true, then maybe you can negotiate with them.
Well, just a factual clarification
Okay.
on this. Is it, do we know to what extent people are being selected as opposed to selecting themselves. I mean, the group decides to do this operation, they've got the vest, and they have a bunch of they have a bunch of candidates, and the one person says, I want the virgins, no, I want the virgins, no. Or is there some ringleader who's saying, I think you should be the one?
Oh, there is
to do it.
a definite selection. There is a selection on the basis of both the degree of commitment to the cause and on the basis of competence. These people, the recruiters want to recruit people who would be
Who won't
competent
botch
to
it.
carry it out, who
Yeah.
won't botch it, exactly. So there's both. Among those who are extremely committed to the cause, there is a selection. And as I said yesterday, especially for difficult missions, there's a very acute selection of people, and usually the people who are older and better educated are selected for the more important missions.
And I've seen
all
that,
volunteers.
there have actually been some, I think, public broadcasting television programs in which they've interviewed recruiters of suicide bombers. I don't recall the context now about whether it was BBC or who did it. And it was quite illuminating. They said in many cases, first of all, the recruiters are very reflective people and very analytical people. I mean, they're assessing the capabilities of you versus you, and that it's an iterative process. It's a long-term process. It's like an espionage, it's cultivating an agent, saying, you know, how. So they may even approach them. They don't just say, hey, Rob, how'd you like to go kill yourself next week? It's much more subtle and over a long period of time, and they inculcate ideas about doing these things, and they say, how do you like what he did? You know, so they're basically going through some sort of maturation process, and then reporting back to their superiors. I think Makun is ready now. Let's ask him. You know, it's quite deliberate and elaborate and comprehensive and incremental. And they, you know, and adaptive. In other words, they say, you know what, I think actually now this is not the right time for him, but this guy is better. So I was just struck by the complexity and the subtlety of the whole process, as opposed to just, you know, saying, well, that's some kids who don't know what the hell they're doing, and we just grab them and they'll blow themselves up. It's nothing like that at all.
Rob, did you have a mind in the econometric issue of selection when you raised that question, and how it would affect the kind of analysis you do?
Well, yeah, we can't do random assignment experiments, and there's so many different selection processes coming. I mean, certainly that's one of my concerns is this teasing apart the causation when we look retrospectively at the act, knowing what made someone do it versus why they were asked to do it versus why they succeeded, and we wouldn't have noticed them if they hadn't succeeded. So there are lots of cases that we don't even notice. So.
Well, you know, when this field was started, the same kind of concern about sparsity of data affected how we were going to analyze managerial decisions in a firm or in the government. And Simon's solution was to disaggregate the decision and to look at all of the units involved and to try to get a database to enlarge the database over the set of, to the outcome by modeling and measuring the decisions made along the way. And I don't know what you guys do, but I'm wondering if there really is so sparse a set of data that Michael was very close to it. He started to distinguish between the people who send and the people who go. You know, that managerial process is revealing data all along the way. And are you guys collecting it, using it in?
Yes. I mean, there are several levels of analysis that are involved in. There is the individual level analysis, the motivations of the individuals and how to exploit them to recruit people and to prepare them for action. There's the organizational level of analysis, the logistical, the training aspect, the recruitment aspect. There's a strategic level of analysis. What is the logic of terrorism from the Russian anarchists of 19th century till now? There is a specific logic of provoking the adversary. So there is data on all these levels of analysis that we are trying to collect to the extent of possible.
So so I'm not so impressed by this notion of scarcity of data as much as a model weakness in terms of making use of all of this data. How close are you to giving me the partial derivative that will tell me whether I should spend another $1 million on this
Right.
proposal versus that proposal?
Not extremely close.
But the
I
answer
just
is yes, spend the money.
I just wanted to address your point about negotiating with collectivist cultures. Of course, there are similarities. People are involved. The human psychology on the individual level is similar. The contents of the belief systems are very different. And I think this is critical, especially when it comes to negotiating with people who subscribe to a very different worldview. There was recently a book published on Occidentalism by Avishai Margalit and Jan Beruma, a very interesting kind of counterpoint to Edward Said's Orientalism. And it treats in the image of the West in the eyes of its enemies, and the conception that the collectivist adversaries of the West have of the West. And one critical aspect is the value placed on life. This, by the way, started with the German Romanticists. The Russian Romanticist was adopted by the Japanese, and now is very pervasive in the Islamist, jihadist idea that the West values life, and the collectivist cultures of this kind do not place particular value on life. The significance derives in one's ability to sacrifice one's life, the lives of one's children, and so forth for the greater good. So this has implications for the temporal perspective of negotiations. Whereas the West, Israel, for example, would like to resolve the issues within the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 50 years. The opposition doesn't feel that this is the time frame. And of course, the plight of the Crusaders and the victory of Salah ad-Din after 200 years of the Jerusalem kingdom is invoked as a sign that at the end of the day, the West will crumble under sustained thrust of terrorism. So the contents of the ideology, people are involved on both sides. There is an individual psychology, but the contents of the beliefs matter, and it's important to understand if one and when one comes to negotiate. Sorry.
This is Matt Grunion.
My concern is that we talk about the different levels of analysis. You say people used to do personality stuff. Gee, it's crazy individuals. Then there's a switch to social, psychological, and situational explanations. And personally, I've got a real concern with that because I think it often misses the point. Let me use an analogy. It's like Adolf Eichmann was pretty well known. First could be a personality thing, then it could be social psychological processes, could be obedience to authority. Then you look at it biographically, and it's clear, there are quotes from Eichmann saying, 1957, it's clear, he says, I could say it was obedience to authority. So that was a cheap excuse, which I'm not prepared to give. He says, if I'd been that, I would have been an imbecile. I was an idealist. He says, I believed in this cause. Had we been able to kill all 10.3 million Jews, I would have said, great, job well done. That's 1957. My concern is social psychology textbooks still write, gee, here's our great example of situationism. And I guess my point is that it's too soon to stop at social psychological process. You've also got to look at historical interpretive things, trying to put together personality stuff, social psychological stuff, and historical interpretive cultural things. And you need at least those three forms of analysis, and you can't stop at social psychology things. And my own bias, I'm interested in life histories, biographies, psychological biographies. I think you need to do that, which can take account of personality stuff, social psychological things, and a lot of historical interpretive complexity that's really hard to make progress with.
I couldn't agree more. I think that ideologies are invented at a certain point in time. They catch on, they become pervasive, and this historical account of the circumstances under which a given set of beliefs suddenly became a very powerful influence is badly needed to understand why now, why the situation now. It's not the kind of external situation like poverty or political oppression that is impelling it from everybody. There is a mediation of historical, literary, intellectual developments that are an essential ingredient. And so I couldn't agree more that all of these factors combine to produce the phenomenon. There's the personality, the readiness to embrace a given ideology. The ideology has to be invented. Suicidal terrorism was invented by Hezbollah in 1983. Before that, nobody thought about it. But then it appeared like a very good idea, and it was imitated by the Tamil Tigers, and of course, subsequently by Al-Qaeda, and so forth. So it's something that happens in a historical moment. An idea germinates in some creative mind, and it catches on. And so I couldn't agree more that simplistic analysis in terms of it's all personality or it's all situation without the historical element of something being invented, something being constructed, would miss the mark.
I would like to jump in here to agree with all of you that there is a problem here with false dichotomies, and one of the false dichotomies is personality, social, and hopefully the field is moving toward an interactionist model, and I think that's the general consensus that there are both. It used to be that personality psychologists thought social situations were error variance, and social psychologists thought personalities were error variance, and now we realize that
it's all error variance.
It's all error variance. 5% of the time you get a significant result, and so it's so there's that, and then ironically, culture is kind of the other. There's personality, situation, and culture. And within cultural psychology, there's also this false dichotomy of individualism and collectivism. And for whatever reason, cultural psychology is completely dominated by that one dimension, individualism, collectivism, where there have to be other dimensions that differentiate cultures. But 90% of the research, or probably more, has focused on that dimension. And it's been the difference between cultures has been exaggerated, when we well know that there are lots of collectivists within what we call individualist or Western cultures, and lots of individualists within Eastern collectivist cultures, and different situations can create different individualistic or collectivist kind of thinking and behavior. And that, I think, starts to address the paradox that Rick has identified, which is that why would people from a predominantly collectivist culture need this individualistic pursuit of individual significance to motivate them to behave? They should be satisfied with just promoting the goods of the group. But people are people, and they have these individualistic drives, even if they're from a predominantly what we call collectivistic culture. So it's both. The paradox, I think, can be resolved by recognizing that everybody is some of each. But there is this danger of treating these as completely dissociated mental constructs or personality characteristics.
I have a comment about our discussion so far, and then two questions that both have to do with the sort of retention and retraining aspect of this. My comment is that as really a newcomer to this subject, I'm struck by how much of the methodological issues that we're talking about are exactly the same issues that characterize all policy analysis. If you make a distinction between just trying to learn in order to understand things in the absence of any particular real problem that anyone is trying to solve, you think about, you have infinite patience to wait till you get enough data so you can use appropriate methods and do experiments and think about all these other things. But when you're motivated to solve a problem, then I think you've done an elegant job in explaining the sort of the combination of theory, of data analysis, of common sense, of trying to put all these things together in order to be useful from the problem-solving point of view. And we all struggle to try to ask ourselves, what is good methodology for the problem-solving thing, where we know that sort of the ordinary academic methodologies, you can't rely on them completely for that kind of thing. Maybe you can use them some. And I don't exactly have the answers to that, but I think it's important that we, recognize that distinction between what policy analysis always tries to do, problem solving, as opposed to just advancing academic knowledge about something, in this case terrorism. My two questions, substantive questions, about the recruitment and retraining issues. The one, I think there was an important, struck me an important policy observation, but not too many people have commented on it since Aryeh mentioned it last night. And so I want to comment on it just to see what reaction other people have. I was really struck by, and these are my words, not your words, I was really struck by the idea that of how many terrorists had in their past associated a personal trauma, and the possibility of a more widespread social response to all people who experience personal traumas, what I think of as sort of like grief counseling, but I don't know what you would call it. That in itself as a social movement, which could be important for all people, having almost nothing to do with terrorists, but also as a byproduct might reduce the supply of people into the recruitment and retention process because we've reduced their need for significance quest. Is that a policy that's actually been thought about more, been tried? Do you have any experience about that? Is it, or am I misinterpreting what I think I heard about that? But it seemed to me a concrete idea that was very valuable. And so I wonder what reaction was to that. The second question that I had was more about the process in this recruitment and retention kind of issue. What I was wondering about is, it seems to me the difference between the leaders and the new entrants and so on. Are the leaders of the organization people who also are just as likely to be the suicide terrorist as the people that get recruited? It seems to me pretty difficult to run an organization in which the leaders are not themselves eligible for this. And then how to convince everybody else, no, it's you guys down below, you're eligible, but we have to run things and we're not eligible. It seems to me hard to get people to believe that. On the other hand, if you are the leader, demonstrate by your own example, or some of the top leaders, that they too will blow themselves up or will sacrifice their lives, then it seems to me that there aren't all that many people who can run an organization and at the same time, die and need replacements for themselves on all the top echelons of the organization. So how does that work? Is it, which way does it work? Does the leadership largely exempt themselves and somehow they can manage to convince the other people doesn't matter, the leadership? How does that? So those are my two.
Can I add something to the first thing that you said, which was, in addition to addressing the trauma that has been sustained, the idea of addressing a policy that creates that trauma in the first place. So what happens if you reduce the amount of incarceration, torture, and death that these people may suffer in the first place?
Yeah, it's clearly something that's being paid considerable attention. Tony Cordesman from the CSIS has written recently in analyzing the Lebanese campaign of the Israelis that avoiding collateral damage and avoiding casualties of innocents in Iraq is as much a priority, should be as much a priority for the American and Israeli military as successful operations, because it really fuels the rage and increases the ranks of people who are willing to volunteer. So it's increasingly recognized that this is really critical. With respect to your comments, Lee, I talked about two prongs of policy implications. One is the intellectual, ideological prong, and the second is the emotional prong of creating or reducing the readiness to buy into these ideologies. And what you talked about, reduction of grief. There is work now increasingly in social psychology about forgiveness. How does one create a situation for forgiveness? There is a recent handbook in social psychology on reconciliation. How do you forgive and reconcile with affection that perpetrated atrocity against your people? What are the processes? What can we learn about ways in which previous enemies, France and Germany, or whoever in Africa and Mozambique, there were processes of reconciliation that are really worthy of study because they seem to have worked, at least temporarily, reduce that hateful feeling of hurt that may last 600 years as they do in the Balkans. With respect to the difference between leaders and followers, the leaders do face a dilemma. Insofar as they themselves are not exposed, they themselves do not volunteer for suicide missions. Not only that, but in many cases, they do not volunteer their children for volunteer missions, and that has been coming under criticism, and of course, the adversaries, Israelis, Americans, whoever, play that up in criticism of the leaders. Nonetheless, the leaders do incur very significant risks. They are targeted by the enemy. Many of them die. Al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden sacrificed very comfortable existence to hide in the banned lands of Pakistan. So they provide a personal model, personal example of willing to sacrifice for the good, for the cause, even though they themselves do not. And I think people realize that you need a leader that is alive.
Right.
And so, but there is a dilemma, especially when it comes to not volunteering members of your family. It's very difficult to explain, and it's being exploited.
Yeah, I'm always daunted by the magnitude problems here. There are two sort of equal and opposite magnitude problems that come into conjunction. One is the big magnitudes, 1 billion Muslims. If even 1/10%, are ready to engage in these terrorist acts, it's a pretty big number. It's like 100,000. If you have, if your policy successes are such that you can reduce this by half, you still have, I said 100,000, there's just 1 million. You still have 500,000 people. So there's your big numbers problem. The small number of problems that only takes one person to carry that suitcase with the nuclear device into the middle of Manhattan. Now there's an infrastructure, of course, and that's where you could make your money here on the policy side. And that's what the discussion is focused on here lately, and it's very nice. I'm wondering about the contribution of psychology to thinking about the kind of strategic or really more tactical type of intervention strategies here, because I don't see that grief counseling or any type of individual thing is going to make you can't solve the problem this way. You can't even ameliorate it small in a minor way. And the suggestions you mentioned last night about how we're going to have these broad cultural things, no more humiliation, no more alienation. I don't know how you really do that so easily, and it takes a long time. And even if you reduce the problem by 50% or by 80%, you still have a large number. And so one has to think about these organizational penetration intelligence kinds of strategies. Now, I'm asking myself, how is psychology going to contribute to those kinds of things? And Lee is mentioning here, within the organization, maybe leaders and followers look at each other differently depending on how you structure the cues and the expectations. That seems fruitful. I'm also asking myself, and I'm really asking you, if you know anything about this, what do you have to know about the psychology of intelligence operatives and how they might function effectively if you try to penetrate these organizations or try to penetrate neighborhoods and change the sort of culture of the neighborhood? How do you, what is there anything that psychology has to teach us about how one might do this, or how one might protect oneself, or how one might find particular vulnerabilities in an organization that you can weaken it in a way? I mean, this just came up, but it's not so much looking at the structure of motivation, because I think it's just going to be too varied, and even if you figure it all out and solve all the methodological problems, as Drob said, if you're looking for robustness, you aren't going to find it there in the psychological theories. You're going to find it, if anywhere, in the defeat sort of things of how you're going to use your intelligence apparatus to try to get tactical information and exercise some disruptive effects.
Yeah, well, there are two issues here in the struggle against terrorism. One is the ability of the terrorists to carry out their attacks, and the second is the motivation. There were successes with respect to restricting the ability of terrorists. For example, the construction of the fence in Palestine has proven to be very effective. There was a hugely significant reduction of successful suicide attacks with construction of the fence. We looked recently at a variety of the Israeli counter-terrorist initiatives to see which ones are effective. And it turns out that you talked about magnitude, massive interventions are effective. Small interventions are counterproductive. So there was a massive intervention in 2002. I forget what the name of the operation was, the Grapes of Wrath or something like that. Mm-hmm. Massive incursion of Israeli defense forces into Palestinian towns that reduced the incidence of terrorism hugely. A small intervention that was carried out over 2 weeks in the Gaza Strip increased the incidence of terrorism. So you can cripple the ability. It's very difficult to deal with motivation. The same results were found in the British struggle in Ireland, the Motorman campaign that involved tens of thousands of British troops was very significant in reducing the number of attacks. Smaller activities evoked vengeance and so forth. So you can arrest the ability, but arresting the ability doesn't solve the problem. And the problem of motivation is critical, in my opinion. It's a long-range problem. It's a problem that requires change in the belief systems of large groups of people. Yes, you're right, the problem of magnitude is huge, but these people do not act as individuals. They act as members of a culture, a member of a society. If you can change the belief system to which majorities of the society subscribe, then those numbers would be markedly reduced. Those millions of people who support terrorism, to the extent that the belief system... So I think the long-range objective is to reduce the motivation. The reduction of ability, especially given ideology that patience is required and it can take hundreds of years, ways will be found to circumvent obstacles to ability. You build a fence, there is rocket technology, and rockets from Gaza have been, befuddling the Israelis in the last several months. Any move can be counteracted if the motivation is to do so. So, it's improving intelligence is important. In some cases, it's very difficult because especially the kind of groups that Al-Qaeda operates are based on friendships, long-term friendships. It's very difficult to penetrate. Many groups are very difficult to penetrate. Hezbollah is notoriously difficult to penetrate. The Palestinian organizations, Fatah, PIJ, and Hamas are a bit more vulnerable. but it's all reduction of the ability, and I think reduction of the ability is only of temporary significance. You've got to at the end of the day deal with motivation, and good deeds, reduction of bad deeds, reduction of torture, reduction of the kind of inhumane treatments that are being advertised is very important to keep in mind. For example, the aid that the United States gave to the tsunami victims reduced the anti-American sentiments in that part of the world, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, significantly. So it's really, to my mind, a struggle for the minds and hearts of the people, in addition to the things that need to be carried out in the here and now, crippling the ability, obtaining the intelligence, doing all that one can. And the intelligence community doesn't need the help of psychology because they have their own psychologists as to how to penetrate, how to create circumstances in which intelligence is flowing. But it's all, I think, kind of temporary measures that would not solve the problem in the long term.
Well, from a policy point of view, the great advantage of what you're recommending here is that there are things that we would probably want to do on other grounds anyway, because they're nice and humanitarian and so that's all very good, and so there's no constituency here ready to argue against it particularly, and some might be rather expensive and some less so, but we want to do them anyway for the most part.
Sometimes humanity is the best policy.
I think that's an excellent note.
Don't take that to your next venue, I will say.
Thank you very much.